Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Justin Roff-Marsh with us. Justin, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Justin, you are a unique person to have on this show because your company is not primarily a software company. So tell us, what is Ballistix and what does it do?
Well, I can, I guess, empathize with software companies because we have a development team. It's a small team, but I've had to figure out the hard way how to go about building software, and I've had to learn the importance of division of labor in software environments, the importance of separating testing from architecture and design and development from design and so on. So it's taken us a while to get to the point where we have a big enough team to have that division of labor, and there's been a lot of lessons along the way. But you're correct, it's not our core business. Our core business is building, or more commonly re-engineering sales environments for generally two types of companies, technology companies and manufacturers.
Perfect. And we're going to get into the details of what that process looks like in a minute. But first, I want you to talk to our audience because they're primarily tech startups. And to be honest, they're generally clueless about sales as a channel for growth. They like social, they like pay-per-click. So do us a favor and speak to the entrepreneurs listening and tell them why sales as a channel for growth might make sense for some, as you said, tech-based companies, internet-based companies.
Well, I think it depends what you're selling. If you're selling something that requires a human intervention in order to make a sale, or that benefits significantly from a human intervention in order to make a sale, then you have to recognize that those activities you mentioned previously, tweeting and social media and so on, are subsets of a larger process called a sales process.
Okay.
So I think if you're in the situation, you know who you are. If generating tweets and collecting likes on a Facebook page are not sufficient to make the cash register ring, then you need to recognize that those activities are a necessary but not sufficient ingredient in this bigger thing called a sales process, which presumably exists within a thing we call a sales function.
Perfect. And that's why I brought you on, Justin, because you might be the perfect person to bridge this gap between tech and sales because of the unique way you view sales. You don't see it the traditional way. You see it almost like an engineer would see sales, and I think that's going to apply to a lot of engineering-driven startups. You call your approach to sales the sales process engineering. What do you mean by that? Break that down for us.
Well, I guess that means we engineer sales functions or sales processes. I prefer to keep function and process separate. The process lives in the function. Okay. But we engineer those sales functions as opposed to allowing them to evolve, which is what normally happens. So normally what happens is organizations will cobble together some sort of sales machinery based upon all sorts of myths and superstitions. And as a consequence, management or the founder ends up with this black box that they don't much understand and don't much trust, but that they recognize they need, or that their investors recognize that they need, so they put up with and begrudgingly write checks for, and as a consequence end up with this sort of uncomfortable relationship between the sales function and the rest of the organization. Now, the appeal of social and online promotion is that is all very scientific. So if you understand stats, and you know something about process, it's very, very easy to get your heads around online stuff. But as soon as we involve salespeople, the tendency is for it to be treated as a black box. And my central argument for years has been there's no requirement to. The fact that there's people involved does not necessarily mean this whole endeavor becomes witchcraft all of a sudden. And there's an enormous amount of science in the areas of production and in the area of projects in particular that's particularly relevant and that can be brought to bear. I think if someone in your audience is selling something that's reasonably expensive, so custom software, maybe custom mobile apps, for example, in more of an enterprise sales environment, You know, if you think about that environment for a second, it's easy to recognize that environment's nothing less than a project environment. You know, in that context, a sales environment is a project environment. So in that context, our advice is very simple. Recognize that and manage it like a project environment, which means automatically, straight out of the gate, the minute we say project environment, we understand a few things. We understand that we need division of labor. We understand that we need to standardize workflows, so we have a work breakdown structure. We understand that we need to have a formal approach to scheduling. We have a scheduler. We have leveling algorithms. It's important we distinguish between those activities that sit on the critical path and those that don't. And immediately there's a whole bunch of science, a whole bunch of engineering concepts that we can bring to bear. So the first thing to recognize is that if you're in a minor sales environment, in other words, selling less expensive stuff, you should be adopting production engineering principles to the design and management of your sales function. And if you're in enterprise sales, selling things that are expensive or complex, then recognize that yours is a project environment and build it and manage it like a project environment. And if you have someone on your team who's trying to get you to buy into a bunch of mystical principles that you don't quite understand, it may well be that they're better off on someone else's team.
Yeah, now I really want to dig in because I want to paint those two pictures really clearly for our audience, because I know about some of the stuff that you've published online. I'm a fan of some of your thinking, but the people coming to this, I want to really make sure they're clear about the difference in your model and the traditional model. So in the traditional model, you bring on a salesperson, and they almost need to be the guru that does everything, and they are the black box in and of themselves. Is that right? They have to figure out the sales, manage the sales, be the point of contact for the sales, close the sale, follow up with the sale, whatever, anything to do with the sale, you give to them, and you just hope it works. Is that fair?
That's true. And founders, investors will often push them in that direction because they have their own pet ratios. They say, well, if you want to do revenue of X, you need to have Y number of salespeople. And there's this misplaced idea that there's a cause and effect relationship, a causal connection between adding salespeople and making sales. And that's a gross oversimplification, probably almost a gross distortion of the nature of reality. Sure, there's a correlation between salespeople and sales, but it's more of a casual one. And if you approach the design of your sales function based upon a model that is that simplistic, it's highly unlikely that you're going to end up with anything that you're going to be proud of at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Unless you strike it lucky.
Yeah, exactly. And so you take what used to be one person, even though it never really was, they weren't really doing it well, but they were supposed to be doing all these things, and you really, what you call the division of labor, you segment out all those different tasks that they used to do as one person, and you figure out a process. And so the salesperson now is not having to do everything to do with the sales, except maybe just the final close or the face-to-face interaction or those kind of things. And so you say you figure out what the critical things are on the critical path, and you come up with a process for them. Is that a fair way to kind of talk about your ideas on this?
Yeah, so our central idea is division of labor, which is pretty obvious. It makes a lot of sense. Yep. The challenge is figuring out how to do it, and also figuring out how to divide labor is pretty tricky. So the trick where division of labor is concerned is to differentiate between what I call critical selling conversations and everything else. And if you're going to have a salesperson, you want to employ a person and have that person perform nothing other than critical selling conversations. Okay. And that might be on the phone if it's an inside sales function, or it might be in the field if it's a field sales function. But the bottom line is that person does nothing other than critical selling conversations. So it's conventional to group together. It's conventional to refer to as selling everything that a salesperson does. But once you start to unpack all of the things that a salesperson does, if you look at each of those activities, hold them up to the light and turn them around a little bit, you're going to realize that most of them, doesn't make sense to characterize them as selling. Conceptualizing solutions, not really selling. Writing proposals, well, that's not really selling. That's more like engineering, really, isn't it? Prospecting for people to sell to, well, that's not selling either. That's promotions. And of course, that's where we need the online promotions, the online marketing activities. So if you pick up those activities one by one, turn them around and examine them, you end up, I hope, concluding that there's just one activity that your salespeople should be performing. And as a consequence, you end up redefining the word sales to mean critical selling conversations. Now, there's an important distinction to make between critical selling conversations and non-critical selling conversations. I call the latter hustling. And the interesting thing about selling is if you take note of all of the conversations that you have with an individual or a company that you're trying to sell to, probably 80-90% of those conversations are non-critical selling conversations. In other words, they're hustling.
Yeah.
It's trying to schedule a meeting. It's ringing the customer who said yes in principle and saying, dude, where's the order? It's those conversations that are critical. It's critical that they occur, but they are not particularly meaningful where the content is concerned. So the first thing that you want to do is take away from the salesperson everything that's not a conversation, and the second thing that you want to do is take away from the salesperson, particularly if they're a field salesperson, everything that's not a critical selling conversation.
Absolutely.
Now, if you, as a consequence, don't end up with enough conversations left to justify having a full-time salesperson, then don't have a full-time salesperson.
No, it makes total sense. And you know, you mentioned earlier kind of an analogy to this that I want to bring up again, just to really drive home the point. You know, these companies watching this right now, they're development companies. They understand that there's a design team or a designer, that there's an engineering team or an engineer. They don't usually expect the designer to be the engineer and to also be the CMO. They understand the division
QA
of
guy.
labor. Yeah, they understand the division within the things they're comfortable understanding it. But then with sales, they're okay making the sales this unicorn that does everything, when really that's not realistic. It's not practical, and it probably isn't going to work the way they want it to. But tech companies are so uninitiated with sales that they can only do what they see, and that's all they see usually.
Well, the reality is a little bit worse than that. That what I call the standard model, or the go-get-'em tiger approach to selling, you know, where you employ one or more salespeople, put them on commission, and hope for the best. If you were to think of a particular profile of person who was ill-equipped to run that model, it's probably going to be a developer.
Okay, why is that?
In other words, if you ran a big organization and you needed somebody to go out there and recruit and manage a salesperson, would you go into the development team and find a senior developer and say, hey, dude, it's your job, go and find me and manage for me a salesperson? So the odds are against you if you have the type of experience and personality that's conducive to identifying and managing salespeople. The odds are already against you. The odds of the go-get-'em tiger method working in the long run are minimal. But if you're a software engineer by trade, then the odds of you pulling it off are vanishingly small. And the damage that it can do to your organization is significant. And there's my message is there's far easier ways of building a sales function than the go-get-'em tiger method.
Yeah, and that's actually welcome advice, because people have tried that and are frustrated, or they feel like they're the one that failed and they don't understand why it works for everybody else, not knowing that it maybe not be working for everybody else either. Because of your view on sales and the process that you really put into play, it's caused you to have a number of beliefs that run counter to traditional best practices. So I want to run through some of these and let you respond.
Sure.
You don't believe in hiring a salesperson as your first move if you decide to build a sales process. Why is that? Because somebody might think, well, I'm listening to Justin, I believe what he's saying, let me go hire a salesperson and they'll put in this process. Is that a good idea?
Okay. Well, probably not. It's not a good starting point. So let's assume you've created a product or a web service or whatever the case is, and let's assume that it needs human intervention in order to sell it effectively, either telephone sales or field sales. The first thing that you have to do is not to employ a salesperson. The first thing that you have to do is to figure out how to generate the sales opportunities that the salesperson will prosecute. And of course, the good news is that most founders are well equipped to do that. Now, it's important that you go slowly here, because in the process of figuring out how to generate sales opportunities for your new product or service, you are validating that product or service. And if you can't generate sales opportunities effectively or sustainably using online tools, you know, SEO, pay-per-click, all that normal stuff, then the issue is not with sales. The issue is with the viability of your product.
Okay.
And it's best to recognize that early and go and re-engineer your product, or at the least go and re-engineer the offering to come up with something that is, you know, if you have a moderately decent product, you should at least have beginner's luck. But if you come out of the gates and you're struggling to generate sales opportunities, then you're dead before you get started. And to say, well, I can't generate sales opportunities online, so I'm going to go and employ salespeople and hope for them to. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable.
Okay.
At some point you're going to drown. Better to discover that sooner and fix it than to delay the inevitable, chew up investors' money, and then find yourself in a position where salespeople can't find people who want to talk to them either. So the step one is to build a machine that generates sales opportunities. Now, step two is, of course, to manage those opportunities. And managing those opportunities means, like in a project environment, performing a sequence of activities that will either convert those opportunities into wins or convert them into losses. Now, if it's an inside sales environment, it's a lot easier because those activities mainly consist of telephone calls, demonstrations perhaps, quotations, whatever the case is. But the sequence will also consist of critical selling conversations. What you need to determine early in the piece is how many critical selling conversations per week is your opportunity flow requiring. Now, if it's requiring 6 or 7, which is probably likely in your first couple of years of being a startup, you do not need a full-time salesperson, because a full-time salesperson has a capacity, if they're inside, to have 20 or 30 meaningful conversations a day, and if they're outside, 20 a week. So if you can only generate 6 or 7 a day, you do not need a inside salesperson. What you're better off doing is having the founder perform those critical selling conversations. So get someone junior to manage the opportunity. In other words, to hustle the opportunity from one step in the workflow to the next, and then have that person schedule for the founder those critical selling conversations. Now, you get a whole bunch of benefits from doing that. Number one, you avoid the cost and the enormous risk associated with employing a salesperson. But number two, in line with the lean startup methodology, you end up shortening the the innovation feedback cycle, for want of a better word, because you have the founder. It all of a sudden it's become time effective for the founder to talk with existing or potential end users, and the feedback that the founder gets from having those conversations will be invaluable. Now, you don't have to worry about whether or not the founder can sell, because I don't care how socially inept a founder is. All of them can sell by virtue of the fact that they're a founder. There's just this special magic. If the person you're talking to on the other end of the phone knows that you started the business, you can be the most offensive person in the world and people will still buy from you.
Yeah, that's great.
I remember hearing stories about Bill Gates begrudgingly going to a meeting with a potential client. This might just be folklore, but the story is he went to a meeting with a potential client, and the CEO stood up and made a speech on his view of the world, as he felt he needed to because he had a dignitary present. And at the end of the speech, Gates kind of woke up and said, "That's the biggest load of claptrap I've heard in my life." And maybe it never happened, but it would have been cool if it did. And the punchline was they got the deal. And the reality is that founders have a special ability to sell. So I don't care how awkward they are, how uncomfortable they are, they can still sell. And they should be doing those initial. The other benefit is you end up prototyping a sales function that is going to be easier to scale, because you have baselines that you've established. You know what the conversion ratio is from initial discussions to demos, or from demos to proposals, or whatever the case is. And you have a working prototype. So when you recruit someone, you can plug them into that system, you can watch how they operate, and if they can replicate the founder's results or something close to that, you keep them. If they can't, then you get rid of them. And if you discover you have to get rid of them, which is not unlikely, then you're going to make that discovery weeks after you employ them, as opposed to months or years after you employ them, which tends to be the case with the go get 'em tiger approach to sales.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being so specific right there. You just gave great advice to anyone paying attention, so I hope they heard that. Another belief you have that runs counter is you don't believe in paying a commission to a salesperson. Why is that? What is your view on commission?
So, Bronson, are you a developer?
I'm a designer, and my brother's a developer.
Okay, so you've worked in design environments?
Yes.
So you tell me, what would happen if you went into a design environment? Let's imagine in this design environment we had a whole bunch of people working together as a team. We had a traffic controller controlling traffic, and then we had art directors, and we had the normal grist-for-the-mill designers, and then we had copywriters, and we had developers, slicing the images and doing all that stuff. What would happen if you went into that environment and said, look, we've got a really cool approach to scheduling. What we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the traffic controller, and we're going to put everyone in this environment on commission. And we're going to compensate them according to their volume of work. So, you know, maybe the number of mouse clicks or the number of straight lines drawn or curved lines drawn, or whatever the case is. And let's say we found some rational basis to connect their productivity to their activity. So it's not complete lunacy. So what would happen if we did that?
Well, a couple things I can tell you right now. One, the volume of activity would go up and the quality would probably go down. We'd all be clicking a lot more ferociously and clicking the wrong spots. Number two, the team morale would probably go lower. It wouldn't feel like a team. I mean, I'm imagining in my head as you give me this thought picture, and the morale would seem to be non-existent because now I'm not on the front lines fighting with my comrade. I'm almost against them. So for me, those are the two things that I can see kind of playing out.
So for those of you who like maths, you know, those listeners who are engineers, you can do this you can build a really interesting model. You can build it in Excel. So you can build a model of any environment where you have division of labor. Now, of course, whenever you have division of labor, by definition, you have this thing called dependencies, meaning resource B is dependent upon resource A to get something done. And reality being as it is, you also have this funky thing called variability. So even if you build what accountants call a balanced line, which means that in theory, every single one of the workers in your design team has exactly the same capacity, on a day-to-day basis, their capacity fluctuates because people have days off, or someone poisons them with decaf coffee and their productivity drops or something. So when you combine dependency and variability, you end up with a model that is structured such that if you want to push the activation of all of the resources in that environment to 100%, the only way that you can do that is to allow work in progress to tend towards infinity. In other words, if you have 10 people in your design environment and all of them try and work flat out all the time, which they would do if they were trying to maximize their pay, what would end up happening is work in progress would climb towards infinity. In other words, they would keep opening new jobs until they ran out of new jobs to open. So you would have a massive amount of work in progress. Work in progress would explode. And of course, that would result in a whole bunch of quality issues. People would be starting work on stuff without knowing the specifications. People who should have been dependent upon somebody else to do work have jumped the gun and done work for them. You can end up with massive amounts of rework. Quality would drop through the floor. Throughput would drop through the floor, and everyone would hate each other. In other words, if you really wanted to come up with an insidious way to screw up that environment, putting everyone on commission would work just perfectly.
The solution.
So exactly the same logic applies to sales for exactly the same region. If your sales function consists of the go-get-'em-tiger method, where you promise a bunch of hapless individuals commission and send them forth into the wilderness to do battle, then fair enough, the commission plan makes sense. But that's a pretty stupid way to design a sales function in most environments. Now, most, not all. In some cases, it makes sense for sales to be done by autonomous agents. You know, and a good example of that is resellers. You know, a reseller is an autonomous agent, and they earn commission. They get paid on a piece rate, and that makes complete sense. But if you want to have, if you want or need for your salespeople to be a part of a larger team, then putting them on commission screws up the integrity of the team as a whole. And that really, for anyone who understands even anything at all about process, shouldn't be any great surprise. The only thing that's surprising for me is that people push back as much as they do against the idea of eliminating commissions.
It's hard to let go of sacred cows. I mean, it's hard to let go of the only thing we know.
Well, it's particularly hard to let go of those sacred cows that have the most sort of tenuous connections back to reality. Because even in the organizations where we work, say traditional manufacturing companies, traditional manufacturers, you know, when we say when executives argue the case for commissions, they have all these lofty ideas that it's going to reduce operating expense and it's going to cause individuals to be more motivated and so on. And that's their argument for commission. And you can expose the elephant in the room by asking one simple question. You can say, well, in your organization right now today, do you have evidence of commissions actually causing these desirable effects that you assume that they're going to? And I guarantee when you ask that question, you will get a deathly silence. Because everyone believes, in spite of the fact there's no evidence. I think it's something to do with belief. If it's bloody obvious, like the fact that the sun's going to come up tomorrow morning, that's not a very. It's very hard to get passionate about that claim because everyone knows it's true. But if you come up with something that's a complete load of bunk, then everyone has to get passionate about it because then they'd really struggle to believe it in the first place.
Yeah. Well, that kind of transitions into the next segment, which is let's talk about the effectiveness of what you laid out for us today. You're saying on the other side of the equation, it's not effective. So let's build the case for why what you're doing is successful. What kinds of successes have you seen?
When I say not effective, I should qualify
less
that.
effective.
And there are cases where the go get 'em tiger makes sense. I mean, if you're selling through agents, manufacturers' reps, or some sort of software equivalents, software agencies or whatever the case is. And sometimes it makes sense to sell through agents. If your product is kind of a low-profile product that the end consumer doesn't want to bother themselves with, maybe you have a plug-in for SAP or something, you might have to sell through intermediaries. So in that case, intermediaries are arm's-length agents. They are autonomous. They should be paid on a piece rate. So I'm not saying that the standard approach is flawed in every context, but in the case of a technology company that needs to have a sales function, the go-get-em-tiger approach or the autonomous agent approach probably isn't the best place to start. It's high risk, and it's dubious whether ultimately it's going to be the best model.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So what kind of successes have you seen with companies that have really put in a process like you're talking about? And I know you probably can't give away names of companies. I know that a lot of high-profile companies hire you. But, nameless, what kind of successes have you seen?
We've seen a lot of successes over the years, and part of that is because we've been doing this for 15 years. So you do anything for 15 years, you're going to see some successes. Most of our clients are not high-profile companies for whatever reason. Our clients tend, for the most part, to be the lower-profile ones, which doesn't much bother me. Let me give you a typical case. I've got a case study for you, and if I said an average client increases sales by 20% or by 30%, I don't see there's much value in that statement. Even if I gave you the range. There's such enormous variation, and I think that if we look at the organizations we work with, so many times their success or lack thereof is nothing to do with us. Their success is kind of predestined when they design the product and put the management team together. If they're in a situation where an ill-designed or poorly managed sales function is holding them back and we fix it, we're going to see breakthrough results. But it's not the case that we created breakthrough results. The reality is they baked success into the DNA of the organization when they built it, and we simply unlocked it. So I'm very uncomfortable with quoting numbers because it creates this impression that we did it. And I will willingly take responsibility for the success or otherwise of Ballistix, but I'm reticent to do that for other people's companies. Here's an interesting case study. We worked with a company just recently and I think I might have told this on Andrew's. Do you mind if I use the same case study as I used with Mixed?
No, not at all.
Yeah, so this was a company that sold an SEO service, a few $1,000s a month subscription, and it's an interesting story because it shows how startups evolve. So the company had started off with the founder selling SEO services on a subscription basis. He'd written a book and had a good profile, and he'd built a little team of operators helping him, so AdWords people and a copywriter and a couple of other people. And he'd been successful. So what he'd done then was replicated that model, and he'd added another team. So he couldn't add another founder. So in place of a founder, he added a person he called an account manager, and then the account manager built for themselves a team, of, a copywriter and a designer and an AdWords person, and they were on commission. So they treated that second project account manager treated their little group of clients as a revenue center, and the costs associated with that as a cost center, and they earned a commission on the profitability. And then they replicated that a third time, and to begin with it was fine, but when they eventually reached a point where the business was collapsing under its own weight, there was chaos. By chaos I mean people were arguing with each other. It wasn't quite as bad as punch-ups in the hallways, but it was tending in that direction. And business development was a mess because these account managers didn't have the gift that the founder had, and the founder was keen to grab all of the accounts that he could that came from his speaking and so on. So the poor account managers were left to forage around because they didn't have the gift of the gab, or they hadn't authored books like the founder had, trying to turn over rocks looking for people to sell to in between doing delivery. And so when we met them, we sat down, we had a frank discussion. It was obvious to me, and I think it became obvious to them as a result of the discussion, that craft shop model wasn't going to be sustainable if they want to grow the business past its current point. So what we did was we got them to reconfigure the business, and we turned it into a factory. So there were functional units, AdWords, copywriting, design, and so on. We took the account managers and we left them managing accounts, but they would come back with work orders that were handed in, and those work orders were broken down into tasks, and the tasks were allocated to the various functions in the factory. I mean, we didn't literally call it a factory, but that's what it was. And then we had a traffic controller, a scheduler who managed the whole thing. Now, the scheduling part's where it gets interesting. There was no scheduler in that organization at all. And our central tenet where sales is concerned, particularly with small companies, is I shouldn't say tenet, a normal approach is get the founder an executive assistant. Have the executive assistant manage the opportunity flow, manage those opportunities, schedule all the critical selling conversations, and then have the founder just do the critical selling conversations. So he said, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to get the founder to do all of the critical selling conversations, and the founder is no longer going to manage any accounts himself. All of the accounts are going to be allocated to account managers. And they were kind of reluctantly okay with that. And we said, by the way, we're going to eliminate commissions, which they weren't okay with. I think one or two of the account managers left, and a couple stayed begrudgingly. And one of them had been earning like $250,000 a year, and they had to have a come to Jesus meeting with the founder and accept that their market value was not actually $250,000 a year. It was like $150,000 a year. So they begrudgingly agreed to take a pay cut because they didn't have any choice. So this is a lot messier than the work that we would normally do, but this business was just a lot messier. So the end result was the traffic control piece is interesting. What we ended up realizing is when we counted up the number of critical selling conversations that were required for this organization to grow at a sustainable clip, it was easily possible for the founder to do those critical selling conversations and have plenty of time left over to do unspecified entrepreneurial stuff and to do some general management of the business as a whole. And not only that, but the executive assistant had plenty of time on her hands as well. So what we did was we turned the executive assistant from being just a sales scheduler to being a master scheduler for the business as a whole. So the executive assistant, beside her, had this massive whiteboard on the wall which contained a schedule for the entire organization, including sales activities. And we made it clear to the executive assistant, the master scheduler, that there was a minimum number of selling activities that had to occur every week. And she was responsible for ensuring that come hell or high water, there was that minimum volume of critical selling conversations. And then the rest of her time was spent just being traffic controller for this workflow as a whole. So the account managers would come back from review calls with their clients with work orders. The work orders would be split down into tasks. The tasks could be written up on work tickets, put on the board, and twice a day they'd move all of the tickets one slot to the left to indicate the flow of time, and they'd have work in progress meetings where they would review all of the tickets, identify what was likely to be late, and figure out how to escalate them. And all of a sudden we had a little factory, we had order, and we have a business that has gone on to scale quite successfully because all of a sudden it's scalable. So that's a good indication of the work that we do. In that case, sales wasn't the constraint. They could relatively easily generate the sales that they needed.
It was the entire process.
We often go into organizations that are saying we have a problem with sales, and we discover that sales doesn't actually end up being the problem.
It's almost like you're doing for sales what Ford did for automobile manufacturing. You're just it's a overhaul. It's a complete process. It touches every part of the corporation, whether they thought it should or not when you came in. I'm interested in... go ahead.
Except Ford invented it. We haven't really invented it. All we've done is copied it.
Well, that's what some of the smart people do.
difference is, and the one thing we can take credit for, is we weren't silly enough to say we're going to copy the status quo. So it's not like we said, well, we're going to collect best practice from around sales functions, because my view was even if you go around typical sales functions and collect best practice, it still looks pretty bloody ordinary compared to the way processes are designed and run in other environments. So our breakthrough has been, don't copy what other people are doing in sales and marketing, copy production environments, copy project environments.
Yeah, and it follows a trend within tech companies that I think people watching this will realize, lean startups that you mentioned earlier, they're following, the lean manufacturing, out of Toyota. And so there's crossover between other disciplines and applying things in a new way and not just accumulating best practices within your own field. One thing I'm really interested about is your machinery for Ballistix itself, because I know if this is what you're doing for everyone else, that you have the machinery in place for your own company. To begin with, and this is the kind of stuff people are interested in who watch this, how do you generate leads for Ballistix? Because I know you said it's not the salespeople going out and looking under rocks, it's not the go-get-'em tiger, so where are your leads coming from?
Well, it's interesting. I had a very interesting experience recently. I moved from Australia, and your viewers can probably guess that that's where I'm from. I moved from Australia to the US because we were building a business here that was going very well, and I also wanted to live in the US, so I grabbed the opportunity and emigrated here. And I came from an environment in Australia where Ballistix is well known. I wouldn't say we're a household name, but if you were to interview probably 10 businesses and say, have you heard of Ballistix? Probably 6 out of 10 are going to say, yes, we have, because we've been around so long and we've been so visible for so long. So I came from there to this environment in the US, where there was a half dozen people who knew where we were out of I don't know, 5 or 10 or 15 million businesses or whatever the case is. So it was a real shock to the system, because in Australia, if we're running short of sales opportunities, we send an email blast. We say we're running a lunch and learn, and we have 30, 40, 50 people show up in 3 locations with negligible effort. We don't have to put any effort in. So when we came here, we discovered that our tricks from Australia didn't work here, because we didn't have a reputation here. So we had to go back to basics. And we made some terrible mistakes. The first thing that I did was I said, well, we got to do things the American way, because we're in America now. So we hired an expensive PR agency out of Boston, who were very clever. And to this day, I don't know why it wasn't more successful. And we also booked to attend trade shows and exhibitions, the length and the breadth of the US. So I spent an entire year lugging around a presentation kit, with the banners and the little desk and everything, until it literally fell apart. A whole year lugging this thing around. And we didn't get any benefit whatsoever from either of those initiatives. And you add up those initiatives, they cost us collectively hundreds of thousands of dollars. The breakthrough for us, not surprisingly, in retrospect, was online. So the way our process works, and the reason I tell that story is to show that we from a sales perspective, we're a startup all of a sudden. The breakthrough, I did some experimenting with pay-per-click, and the breakthrough was LinkedIn. The first breakthrough I realized was LinkedIn ads are extraordinarily cost-effective, very responsive, but the great thing about them is you can target exactly the individual you want to talk to. In our case, senior executives of certain types of businesses. So we started off giving away content, reports that we hastily assembled, and then I was in the process of writing a book at the time. This one here, The Machine. And I'd written the first few chapters, and I think I'm 1 chapter away from completing it at this particular point in time, but back then I'd written the first 3 chapters. So the idea that I had was, rather than giving away reports or white papers, what if I took the first 3 chapters and turned them into a sampler of the ultimate book and give that away? And the advantage of doing that is it looks just like a book. So I wrote an ad offering the book. They created a landing page that makes it clear that it's a sampler of the book. There's a little video of me holding the book, spruiking, type in your details, and we'll send you in the post a copy of this book. And that was a breakthrough for us. With LinkedIn giving away that extract from the book, we can easily generate 50 to 100. Well, we can easily generate 100 plus book requests a week.
Wow.
Easily. Now we're always throttling it back because we just don't have, we have limited capacity to handle them all.
Yeah.
But so that's where we run pay-per-click LinkedIn advertising in Australia, the UK, where we recently launched, and in the US.
Yeah.
And that really generates all of our sales opportunities, except for Australia, where we continue to do other things because we can, physical lunch and learn events.
Yeah.
We used to channel those sales opportunities directly to. I have an executive assistant who lives in Chicago, Charlene, who's very, very capable. She manages all of the open opportunities we have. At any one point in time, we have between about 150 and 200 open opportunities. So that's a huge amount of work for her to do, managing all that. But that queue of opportunities yields from my perspective, a fairly maintainable flow of critical selling conversations. So I do two types of critical selling conversations. I do conference calls, which I do here from my office in LA. And then as part of our sales process, we sell an on-site workshop, which clients pay for. So I'm either doing initial conference calls from here in LA, or if somebody buys a workshop, I'll get on a plane and fly to wherever they are and run a workshop on site. Yeah. And out of that comes a proposal for an ongoing service, and then Charlene will follow up to determine whether they want to proceed or not. So that's basically how it works.
Yeah.
The front end, we used to feed those sales opportunities directly to Charlene, but Charlene just couldn't handle the volume of them. So what we've done recently, which works really nicely, is when somebody goes to the landing page and requests the book, they get added to an autoresponder just using Aweber.
Yeah.
And they get a series of about 10 or 12 emails encouraging them to book a best practice briefing, which is that initial conference call. So that first part, and they use Time Trade, which is one of those calendaring type services to book it. So that first part's entirely automated up to the best practice briefing. And then when someone's requested a best practice briefing, or if somebody actively engages with us, sends an email and say, can we short circuit this process, then Charlene will create opportunities in CRM and manage them through.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much for walking us through kind of your own machine for your own company. It gives us insight into how it really works for you. Justin, this has been...
It didn't start out that way. The way the machine started with us was us spending bongo bucks on PR events and getting sweet FA.
Yeah.
And it also consisted of me flying all over the US every single... So when I first moved here, I used to get on a plane on Sunday night and I'd fly east. Obviously, I live in LA. It's not much point flying west. So I'd fly somewhere east. I'd fly to New Orleans, or I'd fly to Chicago, or I'd fly to New York or whatever, and I'd spend the whole week traveling around. I'd do a day's work in Chicago and then maybe 2 days work in Atlanta. And I did that every single week until it killed me. And then gradually we've experimented and we've discovered so much stuff can be done by remote control. I will never do a face-to-face meeting now unless it's a formal workshop that someone's paying for, because I've discovered it just doesn't make sense to. But these discoveries didn't happen automatically. Now, the reason I'm telling you the story is that I'm the founder, and I was able to spot this stuff. If I employed a salesperson and paid them $180,000 a year, they kept flying around the country forever.
Yeah.
And so you have agility, and this plays into the lean methodology, I guess. You have agility when you're the founder doing this stuff. So first go around, build it yourself, because you have this critical thing called a process of ongoing improvement. In the beginning, the rate of change is huge, and then over time the rate of change starts to level out once you have proven systems.
Yeah.
It's so important that the founder has a hands-on involvement. Now, the objection is, well, I'm not a specialist, and my response is, well, that's why you should have a hands-on involvement. If you employ your first QA engineer and you're a developer, is it necessary that you do QA in order to get that function developed? Probably not, because you're familiar enough with the lay of the land that you don't have to roll up your sleeves and do it yourself. So you can employ a QA engineer, you watch carefully what they're doing, look how they interact with the rest of the team, look at the procedures they're implementing, and you can know that it's going okay.
Yeah.
But if you're a founder, if you're a software engineer by trade, and you're looking to build a sales function, the idea that you can employ someone and and replicate the QA type scenario. It's just a fiction. It's not going to happen. You've got to do it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me close with a couple questions for you to kind of recommend some stuff for us. Are there any resources, are there any materials that you think startup entrepreneurs, the CEOs we've been talking about, should be devouring? Any books, blogs? Hold up yours. There's the first one.
Yeah, so I mean, there are two things. People want to request this book, so they can go to 4appointmentsaday.com. So that's four, the letters, not the digits, 4appointmentsaday.com,
Okay.
and request this book. Well, it's an extract from the book. Now, there's a couple of benefits of doing that. Number one, you get sent the book. Number two, you'll end up on my blog, which is salesprocessengineering.net. And in fact, at the time we're recording this, all but the last chapter have been written up on the blog. So you can join thousands of other people who've been reading the chapters of the book as I post them to the blog. So that's a good starting point. In terms of reading other things, I'm a big fan of the Crossing the Chasm series of books, like everyone else is in Southern California, or in California, I think. It's worth reading Al Reese and Jack Trout on positioning, and you know that they're probably the marketing resources. The big one though is I would read The Goal. Right here. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I would read The Goal. So if there's one book that's going to change your life, and if you're interested by the comments that I had about you know trying to model an environment where you have dependency and variability. Go and read the Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt, Eli Goldratt. It's probably the best read business book of all times. It's normally read more by manufacturing types than by software engineers, but I've recommended it to hundreds of software engineers, and they love it. It's a story of a fictitious plant. It's told. Kind of like Atlas Shrugged, it's told as if it was a fictional story, but but the content is absolutely nonfiction. So if you do nothing else, read The Goal, and then listen to this interview again, and a lot of what I said will make more sense to you.
That's great.
On the startup stuff, of course, subscribe to Mixergy, but I'm sure everyone does that already. What else? Oh, I like Kevin Rose's article, interviews too from Google Ventures. Yeah. But that's a good starting point. Don't worry too much about selling techniques. I mean, if you're a founder and you're in a position where you have to go out in the field and do appointments, you know, there's this big debate about different selling approaches. There's consultative selling versus, in Australia, someone wrote a book called Wombat Selling. I don't have a clue what friggin' wombat selling is, and I don't much care. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about consultative selling, Spin, Herman Miller, or the original How to Master the Art of Selling by what's his name? Forget his name. Tom Hopkins. The one thing every single one of those books have in common, if you read them, is every single one of those books starts by arguing that the traditional approach to selling is fundamentally flawed, and this approach is different. But you know what? None of them are they're different. They're all the same thing. It's spin selling. People make a big hoo-ha about it because it's scientific. It's not scientific. It's a study in correlation. There's no causation in that book anywhere. And in fact, the author makes some mention of that apologetically in the afterward. It's. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's a bad book. It's a good book. The content is good, but it doesn't matter what you read where selling techniques are concerned. Just read something. Yeah. When I started in sales, I was, more of a geek than a salesperson. So I joined Toastmasters Club, and I read How to Master the Art of Selling, and I read a whole bunch of stuff. It doesn't matter what you read. Yeah. My message is the selling techniques aren't the issue. It comes easy for founders anyway. Focus on building the infrastructure right.
Yeah. Well, let's end right there because that is a great piece of advice to end on. Justin, thank you so much for coming on this program, and I hope people watch this interview over and over until it all makes sense. If only half of it made sense, then rewind and watch it again, and when it all makes sense, you're in the right direction. So thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you very much.